Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. We have found ourselves in a moment within the feminist women's rights movement that Criterion operates so closely within and alongside, where all of a sudden the bottom fell out of a bunch of funding. And one more time, this question of how should we engage with innovative finance became a popular refrain. And so just stepping out of the Women Deliver conference that just happened in Australia, there were conversation after conversation after conversation about how do we want to engage with innovative finance? Are there ways that new financial infrastructure, different financial infrastructure, adapted financial infrastructure could strengthen the feminist movement? And so in normal form, Criterion created a set of cards that are built on a set of reframes that say, how can we think about this differently? Because the question usually starts and ends with, do you know, we need funding. Our funding got cut and we need more funding. We need new sources of funding. But it circles around the funding rather than seeing it as part of a broader economic system. And so in this episode, we introduce a set of reframes that hopefully help open up our financial imagination of how to build the systems of intermediation and the financial infrastructure that we need to address power dynamics in how funding and how capital moves. Enjoy. For nearly 25 years, Criterion has been working at the intersection of finance and social movements. This is an awkward intersection. People talk about the need for funding. They name the mission they're moving forward and that they need more funding than is ever seems to be available to be able to move that forward. But to actually talk about that funding, to talk about financial structures, to talk about how money moves, always seems like a distraction and potentially even a corruption of the core mission. As if somehow the farther we are away from money, the closer we are to mission. I do believe that nothing could be further from the truth, because in the end, movements operate within economies. They're organizations with business models that sustain their activities. They engage in economic relationships facilitated by financial systems. And to not attend to these relationships means that they can go quite wrong, that we can end up offside. We can end up in relationships that don't work. Because in the end, relationships are connected through transactions and facilitated by financial intermediaries. Financial intermediaries could be seen as overhead, as the organizations who take too much of the top, but they are, in the end, the organizations that move capital, whether that's grant capital or loans or insurance or benefits, whatever they might be. And they move that within a set of investment processes. They move that within a set of financial processes. And therefore, financial intermediaries in and of themselves have costs and revenue, and therefore their own business model. For this type of intermediation to be effective, we need to build coherent financial infrastructures. And that, in the end, is what's going to get us to long-term sustainability, to actually have structures that are smart, that are conscious of the power dynamics in which they're operating that are intentionally disrupting those power dynamics so that capital, money, funding, whatever is happening can move with greater ease, but also with justice. For movements to understand what kind of financial infrastructure they need requires a set of reframes. So the first, coming back to the beginning, is that movements are embedded in, not separate from, economies. Movements participate in, resist, reshape economic relationships, and each of those moves has consequences for power and control. In the classic definition of economy, the original unit of economic organization is not the individual, but the household, understood as a site where care, labor, decision-making happen. Second, economies are defined by connection, not isolation. Economic activity is inherently relational. Activities are linked across supply chains, care chains. They embed within and shape social norms. And there is a pattern to how economies operate. There's an infrastructure that needs to get built, mechanisms that define and structure how activities connect. And really importantly, economies have a sense of time. It is not just the transaction in the moment, but over generations, how do we affect resilience, repair, depletion, or regeneration? How do economies exist over time? So the first, the grounding reframe, is to understand a movement as embedded in, not separate from, an economy. The second piece then is to understand that organizations are not just vehicles for mission, but are economic beings. Ooh, we like to deny this. We like to focus on mission. We like to focus on program, and talking about funding, talking about budgets is a distraction. But organizations participate in those broader economic systems. They hold assets and liabilities. They organize resources and labor. They bear risk over time. And they shape these power-laden economic relationships in pursuit of their mission. So thinking about assets, liabilities, revenue, and expense. In general, organizations focus, and organizations with a social mission focus too much on revenue. That's the funding bit, right? People will say, I need funding, which is essentially, I need revenue to be able to cover my expenses. But then we don't think carefully about our expenses. What are the things we need to be spending more money on? Where are the efficiencies that we can build within our model? In the end, though, power sits not with revenue, but with assets. Assets are the resources an organization controls and can reliably access that enable it to act over time. This could be property, it could be intellectual capital, it could be reputations, it could be data, it could be legitimacy. But these are the assets that over time enable an organization to be able to participate fully and from a position of strength. Revenue comes and goes as quickly as we have expenses. Sustainability comes when our assets are greater than our liabilities. But sometimes liabilities can be the thing that actually allows us to take a risk, take on debt, to be able to take a risk, to take on a liability, to take on an exposure. We do this so often, but too often it is unintentional. It is not thought through. And so we need to make sure that we don't stumble into liabilities, but rather take them on with intent because the moment requires us to take risk. And then the third reframe is that it's actually not about funding. It's not about money. It's about economic relationships. How do we want to be in economic relationships? Because money, funding, whatever you want to call it, is actually just the thing that moves within a relationship. But the relationship is about the terms of that. We can accidentally or painfully and intentionally spend years fundraising to be able to get a piece of funding. But in the end, that relationship built over years is actually an economic relationship. And we can consider how we want to be in that relationship. What do we want to be the terms of that relationship? Because it's only in terms of thinking of it as a relationship that we can shift power. The funding sits with somebody else until you get it. The relationship is always mutual. It always is a choice about how you want to be in that relationship. And that might be a relationship about funding or a capital provider. It could be an employment relationship or a labor relationship. It could be about the contracts that we engage in for goods and services. It could be about a set of intermediaries that are coordinating a broader set of relationships. So there are many kinds of economic relationships. There isn't just one, and not all of them are dependent. Not all of them are extractive. One hopes that the ones that we are intentionally building, particularly with those whose livelihoods come from their work with organizations, that in those relationships we are intentional about the power dynamics. Which gets us to the fourth reframe. And this is that intermediation, organizations that sit where their role is to structure, to mediate economic relationships, are not expensive overhead. Rather, they are a way that we can intentionally shift power and enable more inclusion. They are not just an expense that takes away from the real work. They can structure relationships and function in a way to determine who is included, on what terms, and with what agency. So we move from saying we need money or we need funding to we need to intentionally support different economic relationships. And so financial intermediaries play several roles. They are often about channeling funds or channeling capital. They move capital from one place to another. They are often pooled. They pool funds or pool capital in order to reduce individual exposure, and often to enable participation of smaller or constrained actors. This is the role that women's funds have played for so long. Organizations who have a closer reach to those on the ground, and so they can take in money from places that would not be able to fund directly to grassroots organization. Intermediaries also have knowledge, and they play a role in mediating exchanges to ensure that those exchanges are just, fair, have the terms, because we can't negotiate on our own, but collectively we can. So this leads to the fifth reframe, which says it isn't about the volume of how much capital moves. It's not the volume of how much funding moves, but how it moves. in this new moment when everybody is looking at innovative finance again, it's maybe not a new moment, but a refocus, particularly within feminist organizations, to say, what could be the role of innovative finance? The reality is that the terms of finance don't meet the needs of most organizations. We need to figure out what is the right match between the structures, the instruments, the documents, the terms that are the defining characteristics of that relationship, that transaction that gets set up to be able to move capital across a relationship. It has terms. And we need to be in the best possible position to be able to ensure that those terms are fair and just. So in short, I've made the comment pretty often that the only thing we can definitively say that came out of microfinance is that more women are in debt. Simply getting capital doesn't necessarily mean that the capital is good. It doesn't mean that the capital is helpful. In fact, it could put us in relationships of power. One of the key pieces here is making sure that we're matching the right vehicle, the right type of instrument with the need. And so maybe what's actually needed is a discretionary grant. That could be true. Or it could be actually a contract that has terms that actually might protect both organizations in a different way. Or it might be debt, or it might be insurance. All of these are different vehicles that say, what is the right type of structure, the right type of vehicle that moves the capital? Because it's not how much capital moves, it's how it moves. So intermediaries actually manage those structures, they manage those relationships, but they manage those in intentional processes inside of a business. So when we want intermediation to be as inexpensive as possible, when we name it as problematic overhead that should just get money to the folks on the ground at no cost, we undermine their ability to do their job well. So intermediaries, just like organizations, have revenue streams, assets, liabilities. They take on risks. Who pays for these functions, and what are the functions that get prioritized? Because these processes that happen inside of intermediaries determine what opportunities are seen, how risk is assessed, who has a voice in the transaction, and how the outcomes are governed after the funding or the capital is deployed. So in the end, these processes are critical. And if we deplete them, if we ask them to be done on the cheap, then we end up with no power. I was in a conversation last week and somebody said to me, you know what I want? I want one of those direct relationships, like people have in business where it's just mano a mano and we work it out. I want to be in that kind of direct relationship. I was like, wow, those don't exist. Those things that look direct, they look like two guys sitting down, writing it all out. It only looks direct because of the privilege in which that relationship operates. Behind the scenes are lawyers, accountants, investment bankers, more lawyers, more accountants, all kinds of intermediation that make that transaction look like it has ease. But when we don't have access to that kind of structure, then we stand without the power. So, for example, if I need to get funding into a country that might have political instability or currency risk, I need to think about, even if it's a gift, I need to figure out, how do I make sure that the money gets to the right place and that when it gets there, it has the same value that it was priced at when we negotiated what was going to happen for that money. If not, you can end up with extraordinary inequities in relationships. And so it is the sort of structures of intermediation, the sophistication of those, that allow us to navigate the complexities of the economic systems in which we operate, but not just to manage the complexities in a wishful thinking way of like, let's get rid of all of those if there just weren't so many complexities. But why not reframe it? What are the ways in which those intermediaries could renegotiate power, could play a role to shift those power dynamics? But to do that, they have to be stable organizations that can effectively operate. Finally, intermediaries are connected within a broader financial infrastructure where intermediaries with some level of formality can operate collaboratively and transparently. This infrastructure are the systems, the rules, the structures that make relationships reliable, that create consistency and trust that allows us to accelerate the movement of capital, to coordinate assets, liabilities, revenues, and expenses at a systemic level, not just at an individual level or an organizational level, and to provide stability for the flows of capital, because in the end, capital funding moves at the speed of trust. So how do we create continuity, accountability, transparency, and the enabling conditions that ensure legitimacy? In some ways, this infrastructure could be seen as a performance. And perhaps in many ways it is. It's a performance where if we all understand the terms of the performance, we can build trust. Because as we're engaging in these economic transactions, because we engage in economic transactions every single day. The question is, do we have any power in those economic transactions? Are there ways that we can shift the terms of those transactions to be able to ensure that they advance our mission? Can we build repeatable transactions that are clear and consistent and transparent, and so it can move with greater ease and be less idiosyncratic, where there isn't just personal relationships that drive how this all happens, but those personal relationships, still relationships, but they sit within a structure, within processes that give consistency and therefore a level of transparency and ease. So in the end, when we say money is a distraction from mission, we're missing the point. Or when we say we just need funding, we're missing the point. What we need is a stable set of relationships built so that money can flow easily, so funding can get to the places that are hardest to reach, and do that within an infrastructure where we operate at the speed of trust.
Finance is one of the most powerful systems on Earth. What happens when we use that power to design a more equitable world? On May 26, join Criterion for Insights and Invitations, an online discovery session for people who want to understand our work and explore partnership through a systems lens. You'll get a first look at our current strategies, from local capital mobilization to feminist finance, and the partnerships that turn influence into impact. If you're exploring how to use your capital, influence, or institutional power differently, come be in the conversation. Register now at criterioninstitute.org.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.